The American Dream. Carlos pressed his forehead against the smudged window of the bus, watching the city slip by in a blur of brick and neon. The morning sun struggled to warm the streets of Houston, casting long shadows over fast food drive-thrus and check-cashing stores. Carlos's hands were rough from work, his knuckles always stained with something that lingered: grease, dirt, or memories of the construction site he left behind each night. He touched the worn photograph in his shirt pocket, a picture of Isabella and their little girl, Milagros, smiling wide, still new to America. It was only 2 years since they left Mexico, but those years felt like a whole other lifetime. Life before America was a haze of heat, laughter, and hunger. Here, it was concrete, cold, and ambition. Their tiny apartment smelt like spiced beans, incense, and lavender, the only luxuries Isabella insisted on in their new world. She had a way of making even the most cramped, peeling place feel like a home. At night, when Milagros drifted to sleep, Carlos and Isabella would sit together on a second-hand sofa, planning for a future that shimmered just out of reach. She spoke of learning English well enough to get a good job, of Milagros going to a real American school. Sometimes she would comb Carlos's hair with her fingers, teasing him about his accent and his stubborn love for old Mexican ballads. Yet lately, a worrying distance seemed to creep in, silent and slow. Carlos noticed the way Isabella lingered near the window, watching the streetlights blink on. Milagros asked more often for her mother than her father now. Carlos told himself these were just the bruises of adjustment, the growing pains of new roots stretching into foreign soil. He rose each morning before dawn to catch the early shift at the auto shop. The work was honest, if unforgiving. His supervisor barked orders in a thick Texas drawl, and Carlos forced himself to listen, learning the words, the rhythm, holding on for his family. He remembered his father's voice in his ear. "You are the roof for those you love. You must not let it leak." At home, Isabella folded his shirt oaks. Even from a distance, Jacob was hard to miss. Tall, square-shouldered, hair neatly parted, and shirt pressed crisp as a banker's fresh bills. He shook hands with the landlord, laughed loud and easy, his presence somehow brighter than the blue sky. By noon, the neighborhood's kids had gathered curbside, watching as Jacob unloaded boxes and big-screen TVs, all brand new. He opened a case of sodas, handed them out freely, turning strangers to friends with just a grin. Older women stopped to admire his muscle and manners. He listened. Really listened when they spoke, repeating names back with warmth that seemed genuine. Carlos stood on his porch, a wrench in one hand, sweat trickling down his temple. His daughter, Milagros, tugged his sleeve, asking, "Who's that, Papa?" "A new neighbor," Carlos replied, unable to keep the edge from his voice. When Isabella returned from the store, she paused at the sight of Jacob, her steps slowing, eyes searching. Carlos watched the corners of her mouth turn up as Jacob nodded in her direction. A simple gesture, but Carlos felt its weight settle in his chest. Isabella swept past him into their apartment, leaving only a faint trace of perfume and new tension in the air. Nobody in the neighborhood had ever talked about moving up the way Jacob did. He spoke of business trips to Dallas and investments in internet startups. He had a dog, a sleek, well-groomed shepherd that obeyed every command with silent loyalty. Where Carlos's old Ford sputtered at traffic lights, Jacob's SUV purred, top of the line. The differences felt small at first, but they crept into Carlos's home like a draft. Isabella began to mention Jacob's dog, how polite he seemed, how he never barked at night. She admired Jacob's car, his clothes, the story of how he'd renovated his last house all on his own. Carlos couldn't help his pride from aching. He'd worked 1,000 odd jobs, patched leaking roofs and broken fences. No one had ever spoken about his hands or his heart with that kind of admiration. The weeks wore on, and Jacob's shadow fell longer across their porch. He waved from his lawn, invited Carlos over for his way to bed. Carlos glanced out the window at the house next door, lights burning late, laughter spilling out, just close enough to hear, just far enough he could never join in. Secret glances. Carlos became a watcher in his own home, not by choice, but because the rules seemed to have shifted, and no one had bothered to tell him. It started with small things. Isabella humming unfamiliar songs as she made breakfast, her fingers tapping patterns on the tile countertops while she waited for the coffee to brew. When her phone buzzed, she'd excuse herself to the bedroom, closing the door quietly behind her. Before, she would read her messages at the table, sometimes playfully handing her phone over for Carlos to see a funny meme or a sweet photo from back home. Now, her phone was rarely out of sight. Monday evening, Carlos found her in the bathroom, dressed in a new blouse he didn't recognize, dabbing perfume behind her ears and brushing her hair with unusual care. "Are we going somewhere?" he asked, almost hopefully. She turned, startled. "No, just wanted to feel nice," she said with a gentle smile that somehow didn't reach her eyes. Isabella's errands grew longer. She claimed the supermarket lines were slow, or that she stopped to talk with neighbors, but there were afternoons when Milagros grew restless waiting for her in front of the window, asking, "Mama, gove antoi kang?" Carlos couldn't help noticing when Isabella finally walked in, she was flushed, breathing hard, her laughter a little too loud, her arms full of groceries she probably didn't need. One night, crawling into bed after Isabella had curled up with her back to him, Carlos caught the scent of cologne mixing with her perfume. Not his, something sharper, unfamiliar, clinging to her hair and clothes. He told himself not to think too much. Everyone deserved new friends. Maybe this was the adjustment everyone talked about, the challenge of fitting in, finding connection in a strange place. But Carlos couldn't silence the tightening in his chest, the knowledge that something about their rhythm, their unspoken rituals, was changing. The next Saturday, Isabella insisted on taking Milagros for ice cream by herself. "You look tired, Carlos. Want to rest?" she said, not looking him in the shoulder. Lying awake, Carlos stared at the ceiling and listened to Milagros's soft breathing in the next room. He wondered if everyone's American dream came with a side of waiting, of not knowing. He promised himself he would not accuse, not yet. For now he would watch, and wait, and hope he was wrong. The first sign. The truth, Carlos would later tell himself, rarely announces its arrival with fanfare. It is a shadow, sidling in through the cracks. It sits quietly beneath the surface, waiting for a careless moment to be revealed. It came to Carlos one Wednesday evening after dinner. Milagros was coloring at the kitchen table, her small hands moving in wide arcs, rainbows, houses, a sun with a smiley face. Isabella busied herself with dishes, her phone face down on the counter, chirping now and then with bright, insistent sounds. Carlos reached for a dish towel, his fingers brushing the phone by accident. The screen woke. A new message, a name lighting up. Jacob, with a heart emoji pulsing beside it. A second message quickly followed. "You looked beautiful today. Next time, I hope we get a longer goodbye." Carlos's heart thudded. He stood motionless, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly thunderous in his ears. Isabella turned. She saw the way Carlos stared at her phone, and for a split second, just one, her face changed. The mask slipping, eyes wide with something like fear. Then she recovered, snatching the phone off the counter. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. "Just a neighbor. Jacob, you know him. He always talks too much." She tried to laugh, light, dismissive, but the sound fell flat. Carlos nodded, keeping his face blank. The pounding in his chest was a drumbeat of doubt and dread. He rinsed dishes, stacked them, wiped the table as if in a trance. He looked at Milagros, who glanced up and offered him a crayon. A fragile, innocent gesture Carlos wanted fiercely to protect. That night, Carlos couldn't sleep. Beside him, Isabella breathed. At work, his hands moved by habit while his mind wandered, replaying Jacob's smile, Isabella's easy laugh, the heart emoji on a glowing screen. From that day on, Carlos paid careful attention. He watched for every sign and silence, every changed routine. He told himself he would wait, gather the whole truth, and not let anger or heartbreak decide his next step. Even as the ache grew in his chest, Carlos remembered what his father once said. La verdad no se esconde mucho tiempo. The truth does not hide for long. Spring pressed in from the windows, coaxing wildflowers up along the sidewalk and painting the apartment in soft, honeyed light. Yet inside the little home, the warmth had grown thin. Conversations that once meandered like lazy riverbeds now snapped short, detouring around uncomfortable silences. Carlos first noticed the way Isabella paused before answering him, her gaze drifting to the window, trailing after some distant thought instead of settling on his face. She moved through the apartment with a new impatience, footsteps brisk, arms folding and unfolding as if hugging her own body for comfort. When she spoke, her words came clipped, tinged with irritation. "Did you get off work late again?" she asked Tuesday evening, chopping onions with a sharpness he felt in his bones. Carlos nodded, setting down his lunchbox. "The boss needed me for overtime," she cut in, not looking up. "You're always tired, Carlos. You never help with anything here." Her voice landed colder than the tile under his feet. Later that week, Isabella rearranged the living room without asking, dragging furniture across the floor and tossing out Carlos's old magazines. When he returned from work, his favorite chair was gone. Sacrificed, she said, because it was ugly and smelled like oil. "Isabella, that was my father's," she shrugged, brushing past him. "Let's not make this place a museum." The little routines that had once bridged their days, the quiet meals, moments brushing Milagros's hair, the shared laughter over soap operas, began to fray. Isabella took dinner. Sometimes he woke to find her side empty, the faint glow of her phone screen seeping under the bathroom door. From down the hall, he'd hear WhatsApp chimes and muffled laughter, private sounds not meant for him. One Saturday, as Carlos repaired a leaky kitchen tap, Isabella walked in, purse slung over her shoulder. "I'm meeting a friend downtown," she said, her voice distracted. Carlos hesitated. "What about dinner?" She didn't meet his eyes. "Don't wait up." He watched her leave, her silhouette almost unfamiliar in a new dress and lipstick the color of bruised plums. Milagros played quietly with her dolls, pressing them together as if making them hug. Carlos's chest tightened. Their home no longer hummed with the ordinary problems of an immigrant family. Now it echoed with something deeper: neglect, contempt, the ache of being left behind. The walls felt closer with each passing night. The distance between husband and wife grew wider and colder with every glance, every word, every silence. Carlos lay awake, listening to the empty spaces beside him. He wondered if anyone ever truly knew when love was ending, or if, like a leak behind drywall, it just rotted quietly, spreading until the whole house felt wrong. Essence. Carlos had never thought of himself as suspicious by nature. Where he was from, a man's word carried the weight of stone, and loyalty was as common as the afternoon sun. But in this new world, this land of locked doors and unfamiliar faces, doubt crept in on silent feet. He tried to shake it off. Every time he held Isabella's gaze, he wanted desperately to believe in the woman he had chosen, the girl who once laughed under Mexican jacaranda trees and promised forever. But the unease refused to unclench. One Thursday, a storm rolled in, pounding the city with rain. Carlos finished his shift early and caught the bus home. As he stepped off, water streaming from his jacket, he noticed Isabella's car was gone. Another lie, perhaps. She had insisted that morning she'd stay home with a headache. Inside, the apartment was silent. Milagros's crayons were scattered across the living room table, a half-drawn picture curling at the edges. Instinct guided Carlos to the bedroom, searching for comfort or contradiction. That video clip. Isabella smiling in the passenger seat of a car that wasn't Carlos's. Carlos's breath stuttered out of him. He set the phone down, but the images lingered, pulsing behind his eyes like an ache. The home he'd built, dollar by dollar, hour by hour, tilted around him. All at once, he understood those secret smiles, the restless nights, every excuse. He tried to be angry, but what he felt was something worse, small, invisible, replaceable. He pressed his thumbs against his eyelids, wishing the world would go dark just for a minute. Milagros padded softly into the room. "Papa, where's Mama?" Carlos swallowed the taste of betrayal. For her sake, he tried to steady his voice. "She'll be home soon, mi amor." He gathered her into his lap, folding himself around her small weight, anchoring himself in the simplicity of her trust. If everything else crumbled, he would hold on to this. That night, Isabella returned late. Her hair was damp, her cheeks flushed red. She smiled tightly, as if erasing the distance would make it vanish. Carlos asked nothing. He watched her from the doorway, feeling the air between them heavy with what was unsaid. He now had proof, but he didn't know what to do with it. The next move, he realized, could fracture everything. Family, home, the fragile hope he clung to. For the first time since arriving in America, Carlos felt truly, utterly lost. Confrontation. The evidence sat in Carlos's pocket for 2 days, electronic ghosts buzzing faint and terrible in the old phone's memory. Every time Isabella laughed or brushed past him in the kitchen, every time Milagros tugged her mother's hand, Carlos felt the phone's accusing weight press against his thigh. It made ordinary chores, sweeping, grinding coffee, mending Milagros's favorite dress, feel like walking underwater. He rehearsed 100 ways to ask the question, calm and precise, or loud enough to shake the windows. Each time, the words crumbled on his tongue. What if she lied again? What if she told the truth? The chance came on a gray Sunday. Rain tapped at the glass. Milagros sat in a fort she'd made of blankets and pillows, watching cartoons, oblivious to the fraying edge of her parents' world. Carlos' apartment wasn't enough? Isabella's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. "It's not like that." She looked away, jaw clenched. "You were never here. Not really. Work. Always work. Never listening." "And Jacob?" Carlos said. "He listened, I guess." She flinched. "He was kind to me. He made me feel seen. We only talked at first." She trailed off, but the silence finished the sentence for her. Carlos's anger surged, but beneath it lay battered hurt. "So you needed someone. What about your promises? Our family?" Isabella wrapped her arms around herself. "I tried, Carlos. I tried so hard. This new country, this cold, I felt alone. And you're so far away even when you're right here." Carlos looked at her, really looked, at the woman who had crossed a border for him, who had lost her smile somewhere in a tangle of bills, late buses, and missed evenings. His anger trembled on the edge of collapse. "Why him?" he whispered. She shook her head, tears slipping down now. "I don't know. I was drowning. He threw me a line." They stood there, old phone between them, as if it weighed as much as every memory of trust. In the next room, Milagros hummed to herself, a child untouched by heartbreak. Carlos's voice came out ragged. "What happens now?" Isabella wiped her eyes and finally looked at him, really looked. "I don't know." In that small gray room, all the pain between them hung waiting, raw and unsorted, impossible to take back. But for the first time in months it was out in the open, no longer festering in shadows. They stood together in silence, listening to the rain and the distant, innocent laughter of their daughter. For a moment neither had the strength to move or speak, but the truth was finally spoken, and somewhere in the chill between them a choice waited, silent as dawn. Aftermath. The truth won in the evenings, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the world pass by. Her phone, the instrument of so much pain, lay forgotten, face down on her dresser. Milagros felt the chill too. She clung to Carlos when he came home, asked after her mother when Isabella was out of the room. One afternoon, drawing pictures at the coffee table, she asked in a small voice, "Papa, are you and Mama mad at each other?" Carlos's heart twisted. He knelt beside her, brushing hair from her forehead. "No, Mia. Mama and Papa are just sad right now." He wished he could explain better. But how did you tell a child about loneliness and betrayal? Instead, he pulled her gently into his arms and stroked her back, anchoring himself to her warmth. Nights were the hardest. The bed, once the anchor of their marriage, now stretched wide and cold between them. Carlos lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Isabella's breaths in the dark. Sometimes he thought of reaching out, bridging the distance, but the memory of her tears, her confession, froze him in place. Instead, he lay motionless, waiting for morning. One evening, Isabella broke the silence. She stood in the kitchen doorway while Carlos washed dishes. Her voice trembled but held a stubborn strength. "We can't keep living like this, Carlos." He paused, hands dripping. "I know," he said, not turning. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Tears tracked softly down her cheeks. "For all of it. For what I did, but also for what you didn't see." Carlos set the plate down. He struggled for words, searching the rubble of trust for something solid. "I was trying to hold everything together," he said finally. "The work, the money, the hope. I thought if I just kept going, it would be enough. I didn't see you, how lost you felt." "I was lonely," Isabella admitted, "but I was also ashamed. I didn't want to ask for more when you already gave so much." They stood facing each other, the wounds between them every bit as real as any bruise. There was no promise in the air, only uncertainty and the faintest thread of longing for repair or release or maybe just ordinary act of a meal. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But for now, it was a beginning, or at least a pause from the pain. Crossroads. The next days passed with a heaviness that both Carlos and Isabella could not shake. The apartment, once alive with Milagros's laughter and the scent of simmering tomato sauce, now felt like a house at the end of autumn, bare, cold, waiting for a promise of spring that might never come. Carlos found himself lost in his thoughts at work. He'd measure a window frame wrong or hammer nails with unnecessary force, earning a raised eyebrow from his supervisor. Each evening, walking home, he rehearsed questions in his mind. Can trust return after such a rupture? Is love itself ever enough? He watched Isabella, too, noticed how she lingered in the bedroom, resting her head on her knees. Sometimes he'd catch her reading over old letters from home, or humming lullabies to herself. She was there and not there, a shadow at the edge of his vision. One Thursday, as dusk crept in, Carlos and Isabella sat across from each other at the kitchen table, their hands cupped around mugs of weak coffee. Milagros played at their feet, building castles out of faded blocks, her small voice a fragile harmony in the background. Isabella finally broke the silence. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked quietly. The question hung suspended between them. Carlos felt it settle into his chest with the weight of a stone. "Sometimes," he admitted. "After all this, how could I not?" He traced his finger along the grain of the table, searching for answers he didn't have. "But then I look at Milagros. I remember why we came here, the things we wanted for her, for us. And I can't just give that up." Tears glistened in Isabella's eyes. She reached for his hand, hesitated, and then folded her fingers into her lap instead. "I don't want to let go," she said. "But I also don't want to live in a lie, or make you live in pain, Carlos." They sat in quiet contemplation, each measuring the cost of staying, with all its risks and work, against the cost of letting go, fracturing their daughter's world. Neither choice felt softly. Not for pretend, real trying. Counseling, talking, telling the truth, even the ugly parts. Isabella let out a long breath, relief and fear tangled together. She nodded. "I want that too. I'm afraid, but I want it." They stood on the edge of something unknown, neither healed nor divided. The days ahead would not be easy or gentle, but for the first time in weeks, the choice lay in their hands. Not in the accident of pain, but in the hard, daily labor of trust and hope. In the darkness, Milagros murmured in her sleep, her small dreams safe for now. Carlos wondered if someday that would be enough. A fragile beginning. Morning brought with it thin sunlight and cautious hope. The air still carried the memory of argument, but it had softened, replaced by the tentative steps of two people trying to rediscover common ground. If the wounds of their betrayal still bled, Carlos and Isabella hid them better now, wrapping everyday gestures in a kind of careful gentleness neither had shown in months. Carlos made breakfast quietly, reheating tortillas and eggs while Milagros colored at the table. Isabella padded into the kitchen, her hair loosely gathered, wearing a faded T-shirt of Carlos's from years ago. He caught her eye and, instead of looking away, she offered a hesitant half-smile. It was a brief, delicate truce, a silent acknowledgement that the war inside their home had slowed, if only for today. The family ate together, Milagros babbling about a friend's birthday party at school. The grown-ups listened, clutching at the normality. Afterward, Isabella asked Carlos if he wanted to take a walk, just the two of them, while Milagros visited her neighbor friend. The streets were humming with late spring. Children played in front yards, and dogs barked at passing cars. Carlos and Isabella strolled side by side, matching pace with effort. For a while, neither spoke. Everything important hovered beneath the surface: pain, hope, fear. Yet, in the gentle rhythm of their walk, something stiff inside Carlos eased. Finally, Isabella brushed her hand again, retreated behind silence. The world didn't shift in a single afternoon. Nothing miraculous had occurred. Yet when they returned home hand in hand, Milagros squealed and flew into their arms, as if sensing the new warmth. That night, after Milagros was asleep, Carlos lay beside Isabella in the hush of their bedroom. Outside, the city glimmered. Isabella's breathing was steady, and every so often she would reach out, her fingers twining with his, as if reminding him and herself, "We are still here." The future was uncertain, a landscape veiled and unfamiliar, but for now, Carlos and Isabella faced it together, even if with trembling hearts. They chose, again and again with every sunrise, to begin. Therapy. The waiting room smelled faintly of peppermint and old books. Carlos sat with his hands folded in his lap, stealing glances at the diplomas and watercolors on the wall. Across from him, Isabella flipped through an outdated magazine, barely reading. Her foot tapped out a nervous rhythm on the tile. They had said yes to counseling together, but as the minutes passed, Carlos felt doubt gnawing at his stomach. In all his years, he'd never spoken to strangers about private hurts, only God, or sometimes a trusted friend back home. What could he possibly share here and hope to understand? When a gentle voice called their names, they stood up, uncertain, but unwilling to back out. The therapist greeted them with a calm smile and ushered them into a cozy office filled with sunlight and soft chairs. "My name is Marianne," she said, her voice warm, unhurried. "This is your space. Whatever you want to bring here, pain, hope, confusion, even anger, is welcome." Carlos shifted, unsure where to look. He felt exposed, unpracticed in this kind of honesty. They talked, at first, around their pain. Marianne asked simple questions. How did you meet? What do you miss about each other? What do you hope will change? Carlos listened as Isabella described the early years, the fear and thrill of immigration, the bittersweet taste of new traditions. He heard her loneliness echo in a way he hadn't before, not accusation, just a fragile truth. His own voice fought, sharp and hot, memories unhealed. But instead of slamming doors or letting days of silence grow between them, they tried to use the words they practiced in therapy. "I feel hurt, not angry. I'm scared you'll give up. I need you to listen, even if it's hard." In therapy, they learn not just to talk, but to listen, truly, painfully, with patience. Carlos discovered he was not as powerless as his silence had made him feel. Isabella realized her pain did not exist in isolation. Little by little, they rebuilt the fragile outline of trust. One Thursday, Milagros drew a picture of her family, 3 figures holding hands beneath a bright, improbable sun. When she showed them, Carlos found tears in his eyes. It was not a sign that everything was healed, but for the first time in a long while, hope felt like something real, not just a story he told himself to sleep. The road ahead remained uncertain, but each week they took another step, sometimes forward, sometimes stumbling, but always together. And in that hard, honest work, Carlos began to discover something unexpected. The power not just to survive heartbreak, but to reshape it into love, understanding, and the possibility of a life reimagined. Forgiveness. Spring pressed its soft green thumb against the city, coaxing flowers onto windowsills and children back onto stoops. Life spilled into the streets, music from open windows, the sweet burlap smell of outdoor markets, laughter skipping from rooftop to rooftop. Yet inside their small apartment, Carlos and Isabella knew that growth was a quieter thing, born not from sunlight, but from long nights and difficult truths. Forgiveness, Carlos had come to learn, was not a moment. It was 100 small decisions. To return home, to sit at the table, to try, when retreating would have been easier. It was a weight carried and set down, again and again. One Sunday after therapy, Isabella prepared caldo de pollo, filling the rooms with the scent of simmering chicken, corn, and lime. Milagros lay on the floor coloring. Carlos leaned against the wall, watching Isabella move with an ease he hadn't seen in months. He remembered times she used to sing while she cooked, her voice light as marigold. Finally, Isabella drew a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Carlos," she said, voice steady. "Not just for what I did, but for running from you, for not asking for help when I needed it, for letting everything between us go quiet." Her words were a gentle tide, washing over wounds both named and unspoken. Carlos closed his eyes. He searched his heart for what remained: truth, love, grief, hope, all tangled together. He reached for her hand, their fingers finding each other with a touch that was careful, almost reverent. "I forgive you," Carlos whispered, the words rough but real. "And I'm sorry, too. I should have seen. I should have been there." Tears shimmered on Isabella's cheeks. She squeezed his hand, and for the first time in a long while, Carlos felt the weight between them shift, just a little. Not gone, never truly gone, but lighter. They talked, long into the night, about mistakes, about what scared them, about the first days when the world had seemed big and open and theirs for the taking. There was no magic, no sudden closing of the distance. The pain was still there, but now it sat between them, not as a wall, but as something they carried together. When dawn came, rosy and uncertain, Carlos lay awake beside Isabella, listening to the soft sounds of her breathing. He understood that forgiveness was a fragile thing, easily bruised, requiring care and patience. But as sunlight spread across the floor and the city woke once again, he felt, for the first time, that they might just make it